Okay, we still have a few people in our adjacent room there. I think there's a big run on doing that simulator in there, but we're going to get started because we really do want to make sure we can cover all of our agenda items and get to some of our really interesting speakers here today. So I'm going to start. I'd like to just introduce this next panel, and I want to understand. We're going to talk a little bit about cognitive distraction. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the American experience here in our next panel. Our moderator for this panel is Peter Kissinger, and he is the president and CEO of the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. Peter is another one of CAA's great partners. The Foundation for Traffic Safety is an organization that's worked very much hand in hand with both AAA in the U.S. as well as CAA here in Canada, and we're really excited to have Peter here and to have some of the people that Peter works with closely on this panel. Peter, before joining the AAA Foundation, he served as Senior Vice President at the Civil Engineering Research Foundation, which is an affiliate of the American Society of Civil Engineers, after spending 12 years with the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, first as a safety specialist and then as a managing director. He actually served as an operations research analyst for the U.S. Coast Guard and has a bachelor's degree in engineering from the Coast Guard Academy. So I'm interested to understand how you got from boats to cars, but we can talk about that another day, I guess. Anyway, introducing Peter Kissinger.
Thanks, Jeff. It is a delight to be here. We're delighted to be a sponsor. I've really enjoyed the morning session, and I look forward to especially the next panel and the rest of today's discussion. At the Foundation, we've been engaged in this issue for a very long time. Most notably in 2001 and 2003, we issued two very major reports on distracted driving, the second of which was the first ever naturalistic study conducted in North America. And I can tell you from personal experience that that was the largest media event that we've had in the 10 years that I've been with the Foundation. And it seems like, as Robin noted this morning, that ever since then, the distracted driving has become synonymous with cell phones or vice versa. And especially lately, I think that has sort of morphed over into texting while we're driving. And I want to leave you with two statistics before I introduce the panel. Every year we conduct what we call our Traffic Safety Culture Index survey, where we look at driver attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, and behavior. And two of the statistics from that this past year, I think, are apt sort of intro to this session. The one is that we found 88% of American motorists thought that cell phones, when people were using cell phones while driving, that it was a personal risk to themselves and their loved ones, 88%. And at the same time, 94% of American motorists thought that texting while driving was a risk to their personal safety, which was actually higher than some more traditional risky behaviors like drink driving. So what we have in for you, I think what we have in store for you today in this session, the effects on basically we're going to focus on cell phones. What have we learned? And I guess this is sort of the Yanks rebuttal to the last session. So I'm very pleased that I had the pleasure of introducing Dr. David Strayer to start us off, who's going to talk about the effects of cell phones on driving performance. David is an expert in distracted driving and cognitive impairment and neuroscience. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Utah and the director of the Center for Prevention of Distracted Driving at the university. Dr. Strayer received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1989, and he worked at GT Labs in Boston before joining the university in 1991. Dr. Strayer has been conducting research on distraction and driving for over a decade now and is one of the most sought-out and quoted researchers in the field, especially after having appeared on Oprah a couple years ago. Presently, he is the lead investigator on a research project that we have the pleasure of funding, where we hope that he'll be able to measure cognitive distractions in vehicles. So please help me welcome David.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here at CAA, and it's quite an honor. We've heard today about the some of the effects of distraction and it's summarized quite nicely. I think in a way of looking at this in terms of kind of a framework that has a triad of types of impairments. Obviously, if you take your eyes off the road for an extended period of time, you'll have some kind of visual distraction, and that will increase the risk of an accident. There's also an impairment associated with taking your hands off the wheel, the manual sources of distraction, and if you are not holding onto the steering wheel and steering with your knee, as some people do when they're trying to eat and drink, your maintenance of lane position will be compromised. These two are relatively easy to detect. You can see fairly easy with an eye tracker if someone is not looking out the windshield, and you can see if someone isn't holding the phone. The problem that's been more difficult to study is cognitive distraction when your mind is not on the road. It's an intentional problem where you're diverting attention from the processing of traffic relevant information to something else. And something on the order of using something like a cell phone, a hands-free cell phone, is something where you can keep your eyes on the road and your hands on the wheel, but your mind not on the drive. And so most of my talk today will be really focused on this notion of cognitive distraction, how we can measure it, and so forth. We also know that a lot of times people will say, distractions have been around for quite some time. Why are you picking on cell phones and some of the other technology? And I think the answer really is that we know that not all distractions are the same. There are some distractions that are relatively low in terms of demands on visual, manual, and cognitive distraction, and they don't tend to pose the safety threats of other activities. So, for example, listening to the radio turns out to be a relatively benign activity. There are going to be other activities that tend to have a more moderate impact, moderate demands on visual, manual, and cognitive distraction, and they're going to have a greater associated relative risk and an odds of crashing. And then there are going to be some activities, and this is what really concerns, I think, a lot of us, is that we're seeing more and more demands placed on the driver in terms of visual, manual, and cognitive, and sometimes just visual and cognitive levels where you'll still have people using hands-free devices, but still taking their eyes off the road or taking their mind off the road and leading to really high levels of distraction. So I think the problem is that distractions have been around for quite some time, but we're seeing with the advent of a lot of electronic devices and the trend for connected vehicles with internet and TV access and all the other kinds of things that people do, that we're moving to this high level of distraction. So I want to start with taking an example of something like this. This is an example that was caught by a traffic camera at a red light in the U.S. And the driver was using his phone, and he says the lights were green. If you look, you can see the lights are clearly red, but he says that when he was looking and his eyes were out the windshield, it was red. You can see if you watch that lights are red for a considerable period of time. He sees them as green, and he runs through and creates an accident. Luckily, there was no fatality, but clearly there was a serious injury in this accident. How is it that his hands are on the wheel, his eyes are out the road, looking out the windshield? How is it that he can actually misperceive and not see that red light? And it was not like it just changed. It had actually been there for some period of time. And I'm going to argue that the problem is associated with the fact that he's not paying attention. It's a source of cognitive distraction, and it leads to something called inattention blindness. So I'm going to start with some observational studies at intersections. It's one of the riskier places where you can where you can drive. And from that observation, then I'll show you some studies that have looked at inattention blindness. To begin with, are there really impairments associated with using a cell phone? There's been some debate. We heard a little bit of a discussion about some of the claims that talking on a cell phone could actually make you safer in some circumstances. At least that's some of the claims that have been made in the past. So we started off with an observational study similar to what we heard in the very first speaker of the last session. We took about 56,000 observations of drivers in the Salt Lake area as they were approaching an intersection where they had to stop. And so we said, okay, as they were approaching the intersection, did they stop or not? And were they using their cell phone, either handheld or a hands-free cell phone or not? And this is important because it's their own vehicle. We're not actually forcing them in a driving simulator to engage in some kind of behavior. This is their vehicle. If they chose to drive to that intersection, it's because they navigated there on their own volition. If they're using a cell phone, it's their cell phone, and they chose to engage in that cell phone conversation. We don't know the content of the conversation. We can't control for those things. But when we look at the effects, we see about 1 in 4 people do not completely come to a full stop. If there was a police officer there, they could actually issue a citation for failing to stop, which is a little bit alarming in and of itself. We see about 10% of our drivers of the drivers we observed were talking on a cell phone. So it looks like our usage in the U.S. Is higher than what we heard about the usage in Canada. And this 10% figure is comparable to what NHTSA has reported recently in terms of about 1 in 10 drivers at any point in time in the U.S. is talking on their cell phone. Also, the odds ratio for failing to stop is significantly higher for somebody when they're talking on a cell phone. In fact, someone who's talking on a cell phone is more than twice as likely to fail to stop relative to people who are not talking on a cell phone. So you can observe without, in kind of a completely natural observational type of study, the impairments associated with use of a cell phone while driving. Now, to the intersection accident, I made the argument that people were not paying attention. And in fact, that we were making the argument that this is a form of inattention blindness. And it's been studied for over 100 years in various forms, starting with William James in psychology and more recently with Dan Simons and some of his famous gorilla videos. How do we test for this idea that cell phones may actually be causing inattention blindness? In this case, we used our high-fidelity driving simulator. We had people talk on a hands-free cell phone, so their eyes are on the road, their hands are on the wheel, they're just engaged in a conversation, a naturalistic conversation with a Confederate. And we had eye tracker, and you can see the eye tracker in the lower right corner. It's an eye tracker that allows you to be able to move your head freely, so we can track exactly where people are looking moment to moment. And we had 2 phases to this study. The first phase was where people were talking, and we had people in a single task phase where they're talking without distraction, or they're driving without distraction. And the next, in another phase, or another portion where they were talking on a hands-free cell phone. At the end of that study, we then basically gave people a recognition memory test and said, I want you to tell us about what the things you remembered observing. And so we gave them various probes and said, did you see this? Did you see this? And we restricted our analysis to things that they looked at. So we know that from the eye tracking data that they actually looked at this object, this truck, this pedestrian, this billboard, and so forth. And we were really interested in making sure that they really paid attention, because if they didn't look at it, if they didn't look at the object, then it's not surprising they couldn't remember it. So when we controlled for the fact that they had to look at it and they looked at it for the same amount of time, we found a pattern of data that looked like this. On the left is a driver whose their recognition memory for objects that they looked at when they're not talking on a cell phone. And when they're talking on a hands-free cell phone in the dual task condition, their memory is cut in half. They simply just don't see half the information they're looking at. We know they're looking at it because we have an eye tracker that tells us that they're looking at it, but they nonetheless don't see this. So one of the reasons why somebody can run a red light is the fact that attention is simply just not processing the visual information that is falling upon their retina. We can also look at other neural signatures of inattention blindness. And so this is a study that we did a little while ago, and we're actually now kind of following this up with work with AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, where we measured EEG while people are driving. And we're looking at a particular way of looking at EEG that measures just how much you're paying attention to information that your eyes are falling on. If it turns out that the reason that you're suffering from this inattention blindness is because the brain's not processing the information, then we should actually be able to show changes in the brain activity from when you're talking on a cell phone to not. And that would be a clear indication that you're not paying attention and has clear implications for traffic safety. If your brain isn't processing it and you don't see it, you can't react to it. On the other hand, the recognition memory studies we've done could be just showing you that you don't remember something that you saw and noticed at the point you were driving. You just don't have memory of it later on. So by recording and looking at this brain activity, we can actually determine whether or not you really just are not seeing it because the brain isn't processing it or not. And the way we did this was, as people are driving down the highway, they're following a vehicle that's in front of them. The brake lights come on every so often as the brake decelerates, the car in front of them decelerates. And we record the EEG to those brake lights as they come on and create something called event-related brain potentials, which are the time-locked portions of the EEG that are associated with processing the brake lights. And this is what that ERP looks like, the event-related brain potential. The little red box down there is when the brake light comes on. So you see the brake light comes on, and then we record the EEG for about a second after the brake light has come on. Typically, if you're paying attention to some kind of an event like that, you'll get a nice large positive component in the parietal lobe. This is called the P300. It's very sensitive to the initial encoding of information. And you can see that in the situation in the black line where people are not talking on a cell phone but just paying attention to the road, you get a nice large positive component suggesting that they're actually processing and encoding the brake information and reacting appropriately. If you look at the red line, when that same subject is talking on a hands-free cell phone, the amplitude of the brain activity is cut in half. So what this is showing us is that when people miss traffic lights at intersections or other reasons why they may actually fail to see stuff, that they may actually be the brain is simply just not registering the information they normally would have seen had they not been talking on the phone. So we saw this before. This is kind of an example of what might happen is that you may be paying full attention to the road, noticing a lot of the information. You start talking on a cell phone, and important information, sometimes traffic critical information, just simply disappears because you're not paying attention to the roadway. You may wonder if passenger conversations produce the same kind of pattern, and maybe you shouldn't talk to your spouse when you're driving down the road as well. We've tested that. And one of the studies we've done, we had people as they're driving down the road, told them 7 or 8 miles down the road, you will come to a rest stop. Just take the exit, put the car in park, and you're done. Everybody, when they're not talking on a cell phone, was able to do it without impairment. When people are talking to a passenger, their friend in the vehicle, they also didn't have impairment. But half the people who were on the cell phone drove right by their exit. In the interest of time, I'll not show you the videos associated with this, but I will tell you the reason why passenger and cell phone conversations differ is that the passenger tends to act as a second set of eyes, alerting the driver to, this is your exit, or watch out for this, or they'll just stop talking. So really, you basically have this collaborative cognition between the driver and the passenger that doesn't happen with cell phone conversations. And so I'll just pass through those. The last thing I want to talk about is a study that we're working on right now as part of the project that Peter and the AAA has supported, where we're trying to actually establish a benchmark for cognitive distraction. And we're using both behavioral measures, reaction time and following distance, but also we're recording brain activity. Like we saw before, we can actually try and use the brain activity to be a metric for cognitive distraction. And we're recording in situations where people are not distracted, they're listening to the radio, listening to a book on tape, talking to their friend who's sitting right next to them in the car, talking to their friend on a handheld or hands-free cell phone. We also have a voice messaging system that would basically allow you to interact with and use a voice messaging system to read and go through voicemail. Email messages. So you might get a message from Bob, and then you have a choice of, I could read it, I could delete it, I could reply to it. And so you just kind of go through that. In all of these cases, your hands are on the steering wheel, your eyes are on the road, and we're just looking at cognitive distraction as we systematically increase levels of impairment. And we do this both in the driving simulator, and we're also just getting ready to do this on the road, so we're actually having kind of cross-validation of simulator studies and the on-road vehicle studies. And I know I have just very little bit of time, so this is just a quick glance at what we're seeing in terms of reaction time. We see the same kinds of patterns in terms of measures of mental workload using the NASA TLX. But we have number of activities that seem to produce no impairment. So listening to a radio or listening to a book on tape doesn't impair your performance in terms of reaction time or workload relative to single task driving. If you look at passenger conversation, handheld or hands-free conversations, you get a significant increase in reaction time and also corresponding increases in workload. What was surprising to us, and I think should be maybe perhaps surprising to you, is that there's been a great push to try and put people into some kind of speech recognition system, so you talk to the car or you read your email. Right now, what we can say is both the reaction time and subjective measures and some of our glances at ERPs are suggesting that that may actually be more distracting and more impairing than talking on a cell phone. And then the last condition we have is kind of a benchmark condition. It's something no one would ever do. It's extremely difficult math and memory problem, but it's a way of kind of benchmarking a real easy and real difficult cognitive demand. You can see that the text-to-speech kinds of conditions that many automotive companies are now moving to is very likely to be fairly impairing and not the savior that we thought it might be. Do I have like 2 minutes maybe? 1 minute? All right. Last thing that I think maybe segue into Amy's talk is we were really interested in the discrepancy between the fact that lots of people are interested in outlawing the use of cell phones, yet same people, if they fess up to it, they actually are talking on the phone. So there's this kind of a hypocrisy, this kind of a thing where they want these laws, but yet they don't really want them to apply to themselves. So we've been looking at this. I've been looking at this with one of the social psychologists looking at attitudes and behavior in our department. And what we found is that if you look at what people say, they perceive that they have high benefits to them using a phone to talk to their friends and family, and they actually have a relatively low perception of their costs. I haven't been in an accident, so I don't think it's that risky. So the risk-benefit ratio is actually such that the benefits outweigh the costs for themselves. But if you ask that same person, what about the person who's driving in front of you? What kind of benefits do you see of that person chatting with their friends? They see there's none. What kind of costs are there? Well, the person almost ran me off the road, so they're high. So in order to basically change behavior, I think one of the things we need to think about is somehow making it so that people realize that they are just as much of a problem to everybody else as that person in front of them. In other words, we need to kind of change that risk-benefit ratio so that it's comparable for the other person as for yourself. So there are multiple sources of distraction: visual, manual, and cognitive. Cognitive is relatively easy to measure if you know what you're doing. You can show inattention blindness. You can use ERPs to measure the cognitive distraction. There are also impairments associated with scanning the visual environment that we heard in our preceding talk, and those things may actually result in some of the differences you see between naturalistic car studies and the simulator-based studies. And with that, there's my lab, and I guess I'll move on to the next speaker.
Thanks, David. I will say that we look forward later this year to working with David to release the results of that ongoing study. And for the sake of time, we're going to move right into our next speaker so we have a little time before the session ends for some Q&A. Amy Schick is a program analyst with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration at the U.S. DOT in Washington, having joined NHTSA in 2007 as a Presidential Management Fellow. Amy currently works in the Office of Impaired Driving and Occupant Protection, which is responsible for developing, testing, and refining best practices and safety countermeasures. Amy's personal portfolio includes distracted driving, and she'll be giving us an update on Transportation Secretary LaHood's priority issue. During her fellowship, Amy served as a staffer on the Hill at the U.S. House of Representatives and as a data analyst for the Consumer Allowance and Rebate Car System. And just prior to her fellowship, she served in the U.S. Army Reserve Finance Corps, which included a 15-month stint in the Middle East. Amy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you and good morning. Again, my name is Amy Schick with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We're one of 11 modes within the U.S. Department of Transportation, and our focus is passenger motor vehicle safety. The DOT has done a lot of great things, outside of passenger vehicle safety, particularly in commercial trucking, but, the focus of this conference and my agency is passenger motor vehicle safety. And I also wanted to extend my thanks to CAA and TURF for the invitation to speak here. Let's see. Okay. What is distracted driving? Throughout the research, you'll see that there's many definitions of what distracted driving is. But NHTSA has a very broad definition, simply anything that diverts your attention from the task at hand. And this has been discussed, several times over today. But there are three primary forms of distraction: visual, manual, and cognitive. Okay. The distracted driving problem. How big of a problem is it? I wish that we had a clear-cut answer that we could say we know exactly the level of risk, the dangers that are posed when somebody drives distracted. The reality is we don't. Our latest data indicates 2010 numbers that 3,092 people died in a distraction-affected crash. And many of you are probably familiar with our 2009 estimates of 5,500 fatalities. And just to bring to your attention, we went through a major overhaul of our coding and refinement of how we classify a distracted driving crash. Okay. Who does distracted driving affect? Well, in short, everyone, but we know that there are certain groups that are more likely to drive distracted than others, and I'll touch upon this a little bit later in the presentation. But something I think that's very important to mention are the unknowns, the challenges, the limitations of our data. As I just stated, we went through a major refinement process of how we classify a distracted driving crash. The number, initially 5,500, now 3,092. We can't compare those to one another. Just to give you an overview of what we did, in 2009, if there was a cell phone present in your vehicle, that was classified as a distracted driving crash. But we know that all of us virtually today, I would suspect, how many of you in this very room have a cell phone on you? And we take those into our vehicles. But whether or not we're using them or the cause of the crash is to be unknown. Okay. And also some of the challenges, a large source of our data is from police accident reports. And it's really up to the officer's discretion to determine, was distracted driving, a cause in this crash? And we know that throughout the country, the reports differ. So how an officer chooses to report that varies widely. Okay. So in short, what are we doing to try to get a better sense on this problem? Well, there's something called the MUC, Minimum Model Uniform Crash Criteria, which try to basically standardize what police officers report in a distracted driving crash. Okay. And there's also a variety of studies and research that NHTSA is looking to. Again, the presentations we have today, it's a holistic approach. Okay. And I just wanted to add the slide. We know that the popularity of cell phones has just increased dramatically. But, just something to be cautious of, though, just because we have a cell phone, whether or not, there's thousands or millions of cell phones, whether or not a person uses those in their vehicle, that connection isn't automatically there. Okay. And also, in March of last year, we did the first national phone survey on distracted driving attitudes and behaviors. And I just wanted to go over some of the key highlights of that survey. The survey was for 6,000 individuals across the country. We oversampled youth ages 18 to 34. And as you can see, here are some of our key takeaways. And this is really consistent, what was been reported earlier. There's this discrepancy. It's a dangerous behavior for others, but not for ourselves. So, the heart of the problem is, how do we convince ourselves not to do this? But something also of interest, too, was to note that younger men in particular, reported or underestimated the risk of distracted driving. And also those in the higher income level, those earning $100,000 or more, reported higher incidence and also underestimated the risk of distracted driving. And this is where I really quickly wanted to touch upon the idea of relative risk. It's very difficult to quantify, what is the true risk. There's estimates that vary considerably from, 3 times risky if you're texting to 23 times as risky. We all know that as individuals, there's a unique set of circumstances. So it's very hard to quantify. quickly, in April of 2009, NHTSA released a distracted driving program plan. It's basically our guiding document of what, how we're going to move forward with this issue. And in that plan, there are 4 key initiatives. One, as I mentioned earlier, you need to understand better what the data is. The second are really vehicular and more engineering approaches, reduce workload from interfaces, and keep drivers safe. And the last initiative is more of a behavioral countermeasure, recognize risk and consequences. Okay, and just going over, again, really just critical, we need more continued data and refinement of understanding what the problem is. And I'll touch on our voluntary guidelines that we just recently released. I know there's a lot of questions. I'll go to those in a bit. Okay. I think it's very important to mention, too, that these are proposed distraction guidelines for automakers. Right now, I think I said February 16th, we issued our press release, but they weren't actually published into the Federal Register until on February 24th. What these are, again, proposed guidelines. We're soliciting public comment. You have until April 24th. So we encourage everybody, if you Google Federal Register and just type in distraction guidelines, that will come up. And I believe it's a 177-page document, so it's quite lengthy, but I encourage you all to check it out. But this is the first of what we plan in 3 phases of guidelines. The latter phases we hope to include an auditory component. But ultimately, the guidelines are just to develop a pass or fail test for auto manufacturers to determine if a secondary task, is dangerous. And these are applying to passenger motor vehicles. Okay. I'll just go over this quickly. But again, I really want to emphasize, though, this is the proposed guidelines. Phase 1, we hope 2 or 3 phases to ensue. The public comment period is until April 24th. They're quite detailed and technical in nature. I know there are some concerns that were addressed earlier. The idea of cognitive distraction, are the guidelines, really missing the boat here. So, again, we encourage everybody to comment, and NHTSA will assess and evaluate those comments and ultimately issue the actual guidelines. And the third initiative is really dealing more of crash warning and crash avoidance systems. And the fourth initiative, which I have most familiarity with, is the idea of behavioral consequences, recognizing risk and consequences. Actually, let me go back one. What this is, one of our primary countermeasures that's been very successful is this notion of high visibility enforcement. So what is high visibility enforcement? It's very intense enforcement that the motoring public knows about through paid communications, through earned media. And it's proven very successful in our other behavioral traffic safety issues in the areas of seatbelt use and impaired driving. In fact, not too long ago, seatbelt use was only 14%. But now seatbelt use stands at 85% in the U.S. And a large part of that was due to high visibility enforcement, click it or ticket. But before we can have high visibility enforcement, we have to pass good laws. And just throughout the world, laws vary, but they do so dramatically in the U.S. This is a map of state text messaging bans for all drivers. So I'll just let you take a moment just to look at it. The green are primary enforcement laws. The yellow are secondary enforcement laws. And the orange is laws that apply to novice drivers only. And this is distracted driving laws, handheld distracted driving laws. All of these states listed here have both a texting law and a handheld distracted driving law. And all of these are primary enforcement except for one state, which is Maryland. Okay. And just to touch briefly on, our first pilot demonstration of really testing this high visibility enforcement model on distracted driving recently wrapped up. It kicked off in April of 2009. We were very fortunate to have high-level political leadership, really steer the way for this initiative. Secretary LaHood is very passionate about this issue. In fact, this would probably be his signature cause if he had one. And NHTSA Administrator David Strickland were just very on board with this project. But we tested in 2 cities, Syracuse, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut, because they are relatively small cities with populations of 250,000 or less. And again, we use the click it or ticket model, but can we apply the same behavior change model to distracted driving? And this was just a quick tagline of the communications logo that we used. Phone in the one hand, ticket in the other. Okay. And how we evaluated our program success, we did observational surveys pre and post each wave. Again, there were 4 waves over the campaign period. I know we're running short on time, so I'll quickly go through this. We had control areas identified. Okay. In short, though, we found that pre-interventions to post-intervention, so pre-wave 1 to post-wave 4, that we saw a large reduction in observed handheld use and observed texting use. In the Connecticut area, this was 57% decline from pre-wave 1 to post-wave 4. So it tells us that enforcement can work. If there's a will, there's a way. And this is just the difference between texting and handheld. But in Syracuse, New York, we also saw similar gains, not quite to the level as we did in Hartford, Connecticut, but we saw a 32% decrease in observed handheld phone use in Syracuse, New York. And also, again, we saw a further decrease in texting, what we observed to be manipulating the phone, which we basically just used as an indicator for texting. Now, with any program, we did saw between each of the waves, there was a little bit of recidivism between, waves 1, 2, and 3. But ultimately, this is a comparison between pre-wave 1, again, and post-wave 4, where there was a relatively dramatic drop in cell phone use. Okay? So in short, what did we learn? Well, we know that the public was very supportive of this. We know that the awareness was very high, that enforcement was very strong. They were very supportive of this. Typically, we sometimes have challenges convincing law enforcement to get on board to enforce certain traffic laws. This wasn't the case for these particular areas. And a quote from our Transportation Secretary LaHood, "Good laws coupled with tough enforcement can reduce deadly distracted driving behavior." And some of the other initiatives that we have at the NHTSA and USDOT, get public awareness campaigns. We have a federal employee texting ban. We developed sample legislation for states to use for texting laws. So what are our next steps in terms of behavioral initiatives? Well, we're going to test this demo, again, on a more complex, a larger statewide level to see, we had success early on in a relatively small controlled environment. Can we replicate the success on a bigger, more complicated level? And then something also to point out quickly is that these demos were in states that had both handheld and texting laws. So we know that's a challenge. Our next step beyond a statewide demonstration is doing a demonstration in states that only have texting laws, and developing good enforcement strategies. And I'm sure many of you are aware of distraction.gov, but I encourage you, if you're not, to definitely check out this website. It's a one-stop shop resource for all of our DOT resources, campaigns, local community campaign flyers, and such. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I think we have a little time for questions. So if you have one, please come up to one of the mics, introduce yourself, and it looks like we have one from the web world. Would the prediction that there would be a difference, would you predict that there would be a difference in driving performance between a simple conversation versus an involved conversation or discussion while driving? From Mario. I think perhaps David can address this one.
Generally speaking, I think that's probably true, but it's not always the case. So we've been doing some work with a psycholinguist. You can make complex conversations that we think that the interaction may be because when you're conversing, you may be using the same neural circuits to think about the conversation as to drive. There are some types of conversations you can have that wouldn't use those same neural circuits. And in that situation, you could have a complex conversation that wouldn't necessarily interfere with driving. But for the most part, as you increase the complexity, you're more likely to make the driving demands more, the driving impairments more, greater.
Thanks. Anyone else? I have one for Amy then. Amy, you sort of alluded to that these guidelines, which we've talked about this morning already, is sort of phase one. So I'm assuming that at some point you have plans to perhaps include some cognitive aspects into that.
There are.
Can you just...
That's a good question. Over the next several years, I know it's between, probably 2014, maybe 2015, we ultimately hope to have published 3 phases of guidelines. The first phase really do apply to, visual and manual distractions. The second phase, more auditory distractions, where we'll really take, a closer look at cognitive distraction. We realize that that's certainly an area of concern, and there's a lot of research out there, but we want to be, have clear and convincing evidence that really is a true risk, and not to discount that, we don't think that is a risk. But before, this is a major initiative that will have a huge impact on the auto industry. So, we want to, be very cautiously, how we move forward, and that's based on, conclusive evidence. So we will.
Do either of you have questions for the other?
Well,
Please.
how would it be the case that people could suggest to NHTSA that there might be a form of cognitive distraction that they should include? I mean, you said that there's this registry documentation. How does that actually work?
Well, if you go to, if you just look up the Federal Register, any search engine, if you just type U.S. Federal Register, it'll pull up federalregister.gov, and then you can search by agency, NHTSA, or I believe the document number. So I want to say, actually, I don't want to tell you because I might have it incorrect. But if you search by NHTSA, by our agency and distracted driving guidelines, you can pull that up, and then it'll allow you an opportunity to either submit, you can mail in comments. There's an address and a contact, or you can submit comments that way. But April 24th is the closing date for these comments, and also we're proposing, or we're going to be having 3 public hearings this month. One will be in Los Angeles, one will be in Chicago, and one will be in Washington, D.C. And we're going to publish the exact dates and times, I believe, tomorrow, the 2nd, in the Federal Register.
But can you do this online, too? Can people...
Yes. Yes. Obviously we realize a lot of people can't travel to Washington, Los Angeles, or Chicago, so you can submit electronic comments.
And she assures me they're accepting European research as well.
It's public comments, so absolutely, please feel free. This is what we need.
It seems to me that policy thinking is going to have to start to go outside the box, or in this case, outside the car, because there's social pressures for what people are doing. There's a combination of multitasking that we're all obliged to do in, a faster society, along with all the social connections that are so much a part of the up-and-coming generation. It's almost unnatural. The policies that you're suggesting are like pushing unnaturally against people from doing what they are inclined or need to do. So if that's not a completely far-out notion, applied sometimes in other areas, allowing people to do what they need to do and looking for solutions elsewhere, tell us if either of your university or government departments are thinking about looking for solutions elsewhere besides laws to make people stop doing what it's very difficult to get them to not do.
Absolutely. That's one of the huge hurdles that we face because, it's this dynamic because, we all are accustomed to our way of life, but we realize that there are safety implications for that as well. So, really what's a happy medium? Safety is the utmost priority, but, how do we balance that? Actually, we're somewhat limited in terms of what the federal government, the U.S. can do in terms of putting forth countermeasures and such. Clearly, we have some influence on, the ability to pass laws and regulations and therefore, but certainly outside of the box approaches, that may ultimately be the true solution. It'll be a combination of such, but that's where it comes into play working with our partners and advocacy groups, and we all have our areas where we can push forth the agenda, and it's just coming with, a multi-approach solution.
I guess we don't know what's working and what's not working. So it's very possible, since not 100% of people are using cell phones while driving, that maybe the fact-based message that has gotten out is influencing some people. But there's a number of people who nonetheless continue to keep persistent in using the phone. And so when the facts alone aren't sufficient. So it's probably understanding why people adopt those attitudes and behaviors is essential before you're really going to be able to get some effective countermeasure. I mean, buzzers with seatbelts, people just took the buzzer out because they couldn't stand it.
Or they buckle them behind their back, you know. It's just, that's really is the ultimate question is why people continue to do this.
Yeah, and I would remind everybody that, I'm old enough to remember when it was socially acceptable, in fact, socially required almost, to offer one of your guests at a party one for the road, an alcoholic drink for the road, and that clearly is no longer socially acceptable. So, and the same thing, one of the speakers have mentioned, the drastic increases that we've seen in seatbelt usage, which again, when I started in this field, no one would have guessed we could have gotten above 20-25% usage rates. So we have been effective in changing the culture in those areas, and hopefully we'll be effective in this as well. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be at this conference and get to ask a question. My question's for Professor Strayer. Like I said before, I'm an industrial engineer, and I will be currently, in my work term, designing car interfaces so people can interact with technologies as well as driving. And I guess my question is, what recommendations would you give me for designing interfaces to minimize driver impairment?
Well, I would actually say that something that, first of all, does not divert the eyes is important. Also, when you're trying to design these kinds of systems, you probably want to look at the mental and visual kinds of workload and try and make those so that they're not taking either visual attention or mental attention, cognitive attention from the road. Because, I think the evidence is quite clear that when you're not attending to driving, your driving performance in one way or another is going to get worse.
Thank you.
Okay, before I turn it over to Jeff, can you all help me thank our panel one more time for a great presentation?
Thanks a lot, Peter. That's great. Okay. So we're going to move right along to our next panel. Before I do that, just to remind you, actually, the reason why we had this emailed question in is that this is all being webcast. And so after the event, in the next 2 or 3 days, you can go back to the website of the conference, and you can watch it again, or if you want to pass the information on to colleagues or people you know, we really do encourage you to pass that along. And like I said, it's live webcast, as well as we'll post it on the site and probably leave it up for a few months anyways. The other thing to say is that all the presentations for today will be also posted on the same site. They'll probably be posted, early to middle of next week. So just so you know all this information, you don't have to take too many notes. The presentations will be there online to get. I want to turn to our next panel, as it were now. This is called Emerging Technologies and Emerging Issues. Our next speaker is Peter Burns, Dr. Peter Burns. He's Chief of Ergonomics and Crash Avoidance Division at Transport Canada. Peter's the chief at this division. He leads research supporting the development of motor vehicle safety standards, guidelines, and related crash countermeasures. This work primarily focuses on assessing the safety impact of vehicle-based intelligent transport systems, such as telematics devices and advanced driver assistance systems. I think it'll be very interesting to hear Peter's comments in relation to some of the data that Dr. Strayer just presented in the last few minutes here. Before being at Transport Canada, Peter worked as a human factors psychologist at the Transport Research Laboratory in the UK and for Volvo in Sweden. Peter has over 20 years of experience in road safety research. So Peter, can you come on up?
Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. And I'd like to thank TURF and the CAA for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'll try and figure this device out. Okay, when I presented at this event back in 2005, I focused on this list of countermeasures, and I explained that we really need a multi-pronged approach to tackle the issue of driver distraction. First off, we have targeting the drivers. This is where traditional road safety countermeasures always focus. Road users need to know what distraction is, they need to understand the risks. They also need to learn about what behaviors are distracting and how they can safely avoid being distracted while driving. Drivers should also be clear on the laws relating to distraction and understand the penalties. Is it enough, though, to place all responsibility on the driver to stay focused on the road where the environment around them is begging for their attention? Opportunities for distraction have never been greater as developers continue to discover more ways to capture people's attention. Driver attention seems to have become a valuable market resource, a finite resource that's in high demand. We're never going to tackle this distraction problem by simply blaming the drivers for not resisting the pervasive demands for attention. In human factors, we call this the blame and train approach. Blame the user for all the problems and train them to adapt to the situation rather than change the product itself. To be really effective, you need to focus your countermeasures on the distractions themselves. That's strategy B here. Within this strategy, we're talking about methods to ensure that devices are compatible with safe driving, design standards, visual displays, controls, safety performance tests, and user-centered design procedures. Prevention is the best strategy. Distraction can be reduced, but it can't be eliminated entirely. Some amount of distraction is inevitable. The drivers will take their eyes off the road at the wrong time. So the third countermeasure we have here, strategy C, is the protecting drivers by providing a fail-safe environment that tolerates a certain amount of distraction. Now this is an illustration of the crash timeline, and it's another way of looking at this issue. Safety measures can be applied at various points along this timeline. So it starts off with strategies A and B under a normal driving situation and trying to limit distraction. And then as the situation progresses into the danger phase, this is where the opportunities to avoid a crash are reduced. And this can be escalated due to driver distraction. And certainly chances of avoiding a crash are reduced if the driver continues to be distracted. So on legislation, Transport Canada, under our Motor Vehicle Safety Act, establishes safety regulations for new and imported vehicles. And these regulations apply to the vehicle's original equipment, such as seating, seat belts, brakes, and telematics devices. Now, the use of aftermarket equipment in motor vehicles, such as portable devices, navigation systems, cell phones, that's a provincial and territorial jurisdiction. So there are a variety of smartphones, navigation systems, music players coming into the vehicle. And the use of these devices while driving is a provincial or territorial jurisdiction. Devices like this, the center console in an Infiniti, are original equipment, so that would be a federal jurisdiction. Now, how about this system? I double-checked with my old colleagues at Volvo, and this isn't an alternative fuel vehicle. It appears to be an aftermarket climate control system. So, to my relief, this would be a provincial and territorial concern. This plot shows the sale of navigation systems over the past 10 years. Back in 2002, we were forecasting a huge increase in original equipment systems, navigation systems. But this didn't really happen. And at this conference back in 2005, we were forecasting a huge increase in portable navigation systems like TomToms and Garmin's. And the numbers really did shoot up. But those sales were soon overwhelmed by navigation applications on smartphones. So where will this technology lead us beyond 2012? I'm going to describe some of the trends. And please note that I'm not suggesting these trends are the right direction in terms of limiting distraction. Navigation is a big challenge for distraction. And destination entry, as George mentioned earlier this morning, is one of the most demanding tasks you'll encounter on one of these systems. It's hard to safely input the address of your destination while driving. And this Audi interface allows drivers to spell out their destination on this little scratch pad where you type out each individual letter. So expect to see more innovative interfaces in the future, like this one. Also, huge display screens seems to be another trend, like in this Lexus. The battle of the big screens has moved out of your home cinema and into your car. It's not that one. Well, we'll be seeing a lot more glass cockpits. There, okay. This console in a new Tesla is entirely glass. Now, consoles like this one in a new Ford Ranger, I think that the days of simple devices like these are numbered. And big screens will no longer be limited to luxury cars. Multifunction display screens are becoming commonplace in more affordable vehicles like this Ford Focus. It'll soon be rare for cars not to have a large and prominent display screen. And devices like these are going to be increasingly common. And that one Samsung up in the top right is not a smartphone, it's a superphone. So we're going to be seeing more of those things. Now, the issue of jurisdiction is not really clear as I'd suggested. The trend is starting to blur. Original equipment is starting to become more like a dumb terminal that connects with portable devices. So portable devices connect either through a wire or through Bluetooth connection to the vehicle, and their content is displayed on the in-vehicle screens, and drivers can interact with the device with the built-in controls. So whose jurisdiction is that? Current industry guidelines say that the content of the original equipment displays are in scope of their guidelines, so they have to meet their safety guidelines. However, the new U.S. guidelines that we've heard, those proposed guidelines do not apply to these interfaced devices. They only apply to what's on the vehicle as original equipment. We'll also be seeing more, move on here. So I think, as I said, original equipment displays will soon become standard equipment, and it's likely that these displays are even going to be required by regulation, but for different reasons. The U.S. may soon require rear cameras and video screens to improve visibility and safety for drivers when backing their vehicles. And dedicated navigation system sales, I think, have already peaked and should decline in the near future because smartphones can now do the same thing, and smartphone sales will continue to increase because the technology is changing very fast. We'll also be seeing more cloud computing, so more stuff that's done offline for both the vehicles and portables, like voice recognition software on the iPhone, Siri. That's an example where you have natural speech interface. Now, the big trend now appears to be apps or applications on smartphones. You think of something, anything, and there'll be an app for it. There's nearly 1 million different apps in Android and iPhone format, and they offer games, education, social media, productivity, entertainment, and there also is an increasing number of vehicle-related apps. So let's start off with buying a car. You have an app for test driving the vehicle. You can also get owner's manuals now, apps for owner's manuals. If you don't know what your warnings are, there's an app for that too, to tell you what those mystery telltales are. Mercedes apparently is opening an app store for their vehicle-related apps. You can also plug in your smartphone into the data port in the vehicle and get signals off the vehicle. And if you're a boy racer and like to drive fast, there's apps to help you avoid photo radar. And if you're concerned about the environment, there's apps you can use to help you reduce your fuel consumption. If you're lost, of course, there's lots of navigation apps that help with wayfinding. And also there's apps for helping you find a parking spot. If you can't last more than 2 minutes without texting your friends, well, there's a host of apps that help text while driving. So these apps read out your text messages and allow you to reply by converting your speech into text. Fortunately, there are some safety apps to limit distraction, albeit I couldn't find that many. There are very few. So these apps here automatically respond to incoming calls and text messages, letting the caller know that you're busy. Now, some vehicles have much more sophisticated information management systems that manage driver workload and control the flow of information to the driver. So when the driver's busy changing lanes or turning, then incoming messages would be delayed. Now, it's hard to illustrate these systems because really they're operating behind the scenes, so there's nothing to see. Now, as the situations escalate in their severity, other safety strategies need to kick in. I'm going to talk a bit about some new advanced crash avoidance technologies that are already on the market in Canada. We have collision warning and mitigation braking systems that when you're approaching an obstacle, you'll see a flashing light and a sound warning you to slow down, and if you don't, then they'll automatically apply the brakes to avoid or reduce the impact speed. There's also lane departure warning systems that will warn you when you're leaving the lane. And a whole bunch of other systems. We have night vision systems, blind spot warning systems, systems that will warn you if you're approaching a curve too fast. Also driver monitoring systems that will tell a driver if they're looking sleepy, or even systems that look at driver glance behavior and can warn the driver if they're looking away from the road for too long. And amazingly, you can also find apps for driver assistance systems. You just mount your smartphone on the dash with the camera facing forward, and you're set to go. I'm not sure how much trust I'd put in such a device, but they're free. So they offer lane departure warning, forward collision warning, even pedestrian detection, which is a pretty incredible technology. Next big thing is communication. There's a pilot study starting this August in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and this is part of the U.S. government's Connected Vehicle Program. And they're partnering with researchers and industry to test vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So this is cars talking to cars. So information such as the car's location and speed is constantly changed with other road users. So you can imagine driving in heavy traffic on the 401. It shouldn't be too difficult to imagine that. With vehicles communicating with other vehicles. And you'd be warned about stopped vehicles before they're actually visible so that you can slow down. And they're also looking at vehicle-to-infrastructure communication and vehicle-to-smartphone type communication, so you can communicate with pedestrians. Of course, there are some human implications of these technologies, and they really need to be designed to meet user needs, otherwise they may not function as well as intended. So there's issues like driver overload, confusion, reduced situation awareness, these sorts of issues that are very tricky. And of course, there may also be technical challenges. So there will be teething problems with these technologies. But all we need, fortunately, is a warning message like this. Attention, use this system only when traffic conditions permit. Do not rely solely on driver assistance systems. Safe vehicle operation is the driver's responsibility. For further info, see the owner's manual. Now, there appears only to be one option, accept. Now, that may be a legal remedy, but it's probably not a solution for safety. And again, progress will be difficult if we blame the user for every problem. So moving along the timeline here. Distractions will lead to crashes. And as we heard earlier this morning, that distractions are a common contributing factor for crashes. There are a number of road engineering solutions to reduce the consequences of crashes, and here's some examples. You have divided highways, rumble strips, energy-absorbing barriers that should help get drivers' attention and cushion the crash, breakaway devices, rigid barriers, and clear zones around the roads. We're also seeing a lot of innovation and development in the area of vehicle crash worthiness and automatic crash notification systems. Those are just some examples there. And of course, if you do get in a crash, there's an app for that as well that helps you deal with the situation, record the right information, take photos, etc. Now, at Transport Canada, we're reviewing the proposed NHTSA guidelines to determine their relevance and appropriateness for Canadian road users and the industry in Canada. We have this Leave the Phone Alone campaign, and there's, I think, a little bookmark or something in the kit that gives the website and more details about that. So you can make a pledge to leave your phone alone, and there's already over 1,200 people signed up for that. We have an ongoing distraction research program at Transport Canada looking at primarily effective ways to measure devices and try and quantify their safety. We're also looking at different advanced crash avoidance systems and developing standards for these devices and test methods. And we're also looking at warning interfaces too. How do you determine whether a warning gets a fast and appropriate response from the driver? So we're looking at ways of determining that. So there are effective options for limiting driver distraction that can be applied to the design and management of in-vehicle information systems. Redundant countermeasures in the driver vehicle road system can help limit the consequences of distraction. And there are emerging technologies that are offering new challenges as well as solutions for limiting distraction. Transport Canada encourages vehicle and electronics manufacturers to design devices that are compatible with safe driving and to follow all relevant safety guidelines and best practices. And there at the bottom you can see our driving distraction website at Transport Canada. And one safety issue that I'd really never predicted is distracted skiing. And skiing is dangerous enough without distraction. But perhaps we'll have a panel on this at the next distraction conference. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So, questions for Dr. Burns?
Karen Bowman with Drop It and Drive. Really interesting to hear the information that you're sharing with respect to the automotive industry. I was just wondering, with some companies in the automotive industry stating that the technology they're providing in vehicles is in response to customer demand, therefore somewhat, at least legally, absolving themselves of responsibility, what role is Transport Canada going to be taking with the automotive industry to help mitigate the amount of technology that's going into vehicles, when I would tend to say that perhaps it's not so much responding to customer demand, but it's creating the demand?
Well, right now we're recommending that they follow the latest guidelines, and most manufacturers already are following the Alliance guidelines. So these were some voluntary guidelines that they developed about 10 years ago to ensure that devices are compatible with safe driving. And there's also European guidelines and Japanese guidelines, and then also these new U.S. guidelines will hopefully address the issue. And we're going to be looking at those guidelines and seeing whether or not we'll adopt a similar approach in Canada.
Thank you. One follow-up question, if you don't mind. When we talk about this issue as part of our organization, one very basic question comes up. Can the automotive industry not create a system within those vehicles where those non-essential tools and wonderful technology devices can be just turned off once the emergency brake goes off and the car is actually in motion?
Well, certainly it's possible. There are lockouts, and some manufacturers do lock out tasks that they consider overly demanding. But I think you really need to ask the manufacturers about their approach.
Thank you.
Hello, Adrian Matheson, University of Toronto. So with respect to the devices you do have jurisdiction over, just wondering if you're going to have glass cockpits, so like the basic vehicle functions controlled by the software. I just wondered if it's being considered to have those ones be able to be changed in the future. So basically making sure that they will enable firmware updates so that future laws can apply to vehicles that were rolled out earlier than that year.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it's happening already. So they do update the firmware in vehicles through service appointments. And also, it's conceivable a similar approach could be used for recalls in the case of defects on such systems.
Okay. So you do mean that a vehicle rolled out now with that kind of interface, you roll out a new design guideline that all new vehicles have to abide by, then this earlier one would have to?
Well, it would certainly be possible with the glass cockpit type approach, and I'm not suggesting that's the way it should be done. Typically with guidelines, it would be from one point in time and beyond, and it wouldn't be applied to previous systems that are already on the market.
Hi, Teresa DeFelice with the Canadian Automobile Association, the member club here in South Central Ontario. What consideration, if any, has been given to leveling out the oversight? So you talk about the federal level having jurisdiction over the original equipment manufacturers, but the other jurisdiction being provincial with sort of introduction into the car. So has there been any discussion at all about sort of rationalizing that so one level of government is responsible?
Well, it's really a shared responsibility, and these discussions are being had. So I do think it has to be both a federal and provincial territorial approach to try and limit distraction in vehicles.
I have just one more question before we break for lunch, and that is, from a research perspective, what's Transport Canada doing, if anything, in regard to commissioning research, sort of like maybe like Dr. Strayer and some of the others that have spoken this morning doing? Is there any work that you're commissioning in that space, and to what extent might that help you guys in terms of decision making about what regulatory-wise you might recommend?
Well, we do have an in-house research capacity, and we have a driving simulator and a test center, so we do our own research as well as commissioning work. We're also contributing to a Canadian naturalistic driving study that will hopefully